the most of the benefit in terms of animal performance that you could get from mixed swards is coming in the post-weaning period, where the lambs were performing significantly better in the post-weaning period compared to that when they were grazing a grass-only sward. So to get the most out of that, I suppose you can use that information to your benefit. So to prioritise perhaps an area that you would have in a mixed species for post-weaning lamb performance, and I suppose picking off perhaps a batch of lambs and putting them onto that. So using then having appropriate infrastructure then to use that to rotate around that area, to use that to the most benefit that you can.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Chocolate Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this week's episode, we chat to postgraduate student McGrane about some of the factors influencing the establishment and persistency of companion herb and legume forages in sheep swards. This explains us the impact that the different establishment methods have, challenges around getting them re-established within swards, and the effect that different seed mate has on the content and persistency. As with all reseeds, post-sowing management has a big impact. Lisa discusses what they found by altering post-grazing sward height on these different forages, on the persistency within the sward over a number of years. We finish up the episode with Lisa offering some advice to those sowing out this year for the first time, the target towards finishing lamb groups, and the importance of getting that grazing infrastructure right to get the best out of their reseed. We start off the episode, however, with Lisa discussing some of the work they've undertaken in the area, examining the impact that these herbs and legumes have on both performance and productivity.
So over the last few years, we have been looking into more diverse sward mixtures under sheep systems here in Athenry. I suppose by right we don't have what's known as the multi-species sward, but what we do have is binary mixtures of perennial ryegrass and one other companion forage. So we have perennial ryegrass and white clover, perennial ryegrass and red clover, perennial ryegrass and plantain, or perennial ryegrass and chicory. And so I suppose at the outside of this project, we set up a farmlet study to compare those different sward types under sheep systems. And we wanted to, I suppose, measure elements such as animal performance, so looking at the lamb performance, lamb weights, daily weight gains, and also the yoke performance. And then secondly, we wanted to look at the sward performance, so sward production, and particularly the establishment and the persistency of those particular forages under a sheep system.
Yes, a lot of this is relatively new to most of our listeners and ourselves indeed, but it has thrown up a lot of questions about different aspects of management, as you touched on there, the different establishment methods over the years. You've looked at various aspects of that in performance and both of the sward itself and of the animals on it. But I suppose one of the challenges is you've seen benefits in terms of animal performance, but one of the challenges with this is to keep it persistent in the sward.
Yeah, so I think that the initial results of these studies would show that there is definite gains to be made in terms of animal performance. So the lambs on the trials over the 4-year period were finishing between 16 and 28 days ahead of those on a grass-only diet. There was definite gains to be made there. It didn't go without its challenges, I think that's fair to say. And there are the main issues that we would have, I suppose, experienced with the swards over the first farmlet study would have been in the areas of establishment of those forages and particularly persistence, so getting them to last in the sward over time, I guess. And as a result of those, we had wanted to look at what could we alter in our management. What could we alter with our management to help those forages to firstly establish and then to persist as long as possible in the sward over time. So we set up the different plot trials in 2020 and 2019, and we looked at different various management factors. So we looked firstly at establishment methods. So what method did you use to establish that sward? We looked at different seeding rates to use. We looked at sowing with a tetraploid or a diploid perennial ryegrass in that mixture. And then I suppose lastly, and perhaps most interestingly, we tried to vary the post-grazing sward height that we were implementing with the sheep grazing to see what difference would that make to the persistency of those forages over time.
As you indicated earlier, you're looking at these companion herbs and legumes on an individual basis, not as a multi-species, but to an extent, it gives you a better grasp of how they perform during the year. If we just maybe touch firstly on the establishment methods, like what did you look at and what were your key findings?
Yeah, so I suppose on farm there's any amount of variations of reseeding methods. The ones that we used here on the trials in Athenry, we used a conventional, which was like a full plough till sow. We used disc harrow, which is disc harrow and parrow harrowed and sown. We used parrow harrow only and sown, and then we used the direct drill method, so with no cultivation or stitch system. And so for us, I suppose the four different methods that we chose just show a varying level of cultivation of the soil, I guess. So the results of that, we saw that there was no difference in the amount of white clover, red clover, or chicory that was establishing and persistent in those swards, irrespective of the method that was used, which is quite positive. You can use, all of the forages, they established quite well under all of the methods that we used. And so that gives the farmer a choice as to what's available on their system, what machinery they might have themselves or locally. And we did see a small difference in plantain content. So we did see that there was 6.8% higher plantain content in the swards over time if they were sown by the direct drill method than when they were sown by the conventional method. So I guess that's quite a positive as well. It shows that the plantain was very suitable to be sown by that direct drill method, which would have environmental benefits, and you wouldn't have to have a full cultivation of the sward, and you could still establish those forages successfully.
Once you were getting good soil seed contact, it was sufficient in any of the methods then?
Yeah, so as long as those methods, I suppose, were carried out correctly and getting good seed contact, yeah, we were getting successful establishment of all the forages.
I suppose I just put this in context of it. The swards that you were trying to establish them in, the prep on them before, and they were all sprayed off prior to you going in with them.
Yeah, so on this trial, yeah, they were all sprayed off completely before we used any of those methods. I suppose in terms of establishment or reseeding advice, I suppose the same advice for reseeding, say, a mixed species or multi-species mixture applies as it would do if you were trying to establish a grass-only a mixture. You have to choose, I suppose, your site correctly, trying to establish these mixtures in a site which has prone to a lot of weed problems, wouldn't be sufficient, because these sward types, particularly the herbs, you can't use a post-emergent spray. You can't, your weed control is very limited after the establishment. So it's very important, if you were to be thinking of reseeding with a multi-species mixture, to be choosing a site which doesn't have a large weed problem, or and I suppose trying to tackle that weed problem prior to establishment of these swards. The same advice then would also be there for in terms of soil fertility and pH. So you would need to be trying to address any issues, getting a soil test done, and address any issues in pH or soil fertility prior to establishment of these swards, same as you would with a grass only.
Look, just in terms of the establishment methods, before I move off it, we did mention that this persistency can be an issue. You've looked at now over a number of years. Just let's maybe put that a little bit in context. How long are some of these lasting in the sward, and is it possible to go back in afterwards and try and re-establish some of them?
Yeah, so I suppose with the way that we have done it separately, it allows us to see what each of the forages will do individually. We've seen varied persistence. So I suppose that perhaps the red clover and the chicory are the least persistent of those that we have investigated here. You're getting perhaps 2 to 4 years out of those forages, depending on your management, I suppose. Your plantain might last a little bit longer, and your white clover then, I suppose, with correct management, that can persist for a good number of years in your sward. So at the moment, I suppose we were looking at establishing these swards from the outset, but yeah, it does come into question as to, for example, if you were to plant a multi-species sward, and after 2 to 4 years, some of the elements are dropping out, the options to try and perhaps oversow some of these elements back into the sward. So we have done a small bit of work on trying to oversow particularly plantain into the swards, and I suppose, to be honest, the results have been mixed, but it definitely is an area which we need to do some more research into in the future to try and I suppose get proper management advice as to what will work to try and oversow these mixed sward types without having to go back to do a full reseed again.
I suppose the challenge we always face in sheep swards, Lisa, is that sward density is always going to be an issue. Maybe our dairy counterparts might have a little bit more success with trying to get them re-established.
Yeah, so sheep swards are very dense in nature, and then they always will be, and that can be quite challenging then to try and oversow or re-establish the likes of the clovers or the herbs back into a sward which is very dense. I suppose any work that we have done on that type of oversowing, I suppose it's very important to try and get a good seed soil contact, sorry, to try and give those elements, those forages you're trying to re-establish, the best chance at establishment. And then going forward, I suppose the same advice that would be there for the likes of trying to oversow white clover into a grass sward, to try and, I suppose, keep down the grass covers to allow light down to the base of the sward to help the establishment and the growth of those forages that you're trying to re-establish.
Yes, some of those challenges certainly worth looking at a bit more over the coming years. Lisa, you mentioned also about the impact seeding rate can have and what type of ryegrass you go, what is diploid or tetraploid. Just talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we tried out varying seeding rates with the various mixtures in a plot trial here in Athenry. In this plot trial, what we did was we used a total seeding rate of 25 kilos per hectare in all of the plots. And then within that 25 kilos, we varied how much of that 25 kilos was made up of clover or herb seed, depending on the sward mixture. So for the clover treatments, we used 2.5, 5 or 7.5 kilos of clover per hectare to make up the low, medium and high seeding rates. And then for the herbs, we were including either 2, 3.5 or 5 kilos of herbs per hectare in those mixtures. And I suppose what we saw over time was that the white clover was, again, as it has been in all of the plot trials, very resilient. So at that high seeding rate of 2.5 kilos of clover per hectare, there was no added benefit of going to the medium, the 5 kilos per hectare, or the high 7.5 kilos per hectare. You were getting similar levels of white clover. What's important to say, I suppose, that you still do need to be aware of how much white clover seed is in the mixture that you're buying, as some of the commercial seed mixes that might be available would have lower levels of white clover than that included in the mixture. So that would be the equivalent if you're working in per acres. I suppose we were seeding at a total seeding rate of about 10 kilos of seed per acre, including clover at a rate of 1 kilo, 2 kilos or 3 kilos per acre, and including herbs at a rate of 0.8, 1.4 or 2 kilos of herbs per acre.
So it had a major impact on the clover, and I suppose that 1 kilo rate would be more or less standard in a lot of the better grass mixes that are going in. What about on the herb side though?
Yeah, so for the inclusion of red clover and plantain, we did see that there was a benefit of moving from the low seeding rate to the medium seeding rate to the high seeding rate. So that would show that there was a benefit in using that high inclusion of either red clover or plantain in that mixture. For the inclusion of chicory, then we saw increases in chicory content when we moved from the low to the medium, but there was no real additional benefit of moving to that high seeding rate for the perennial ryegrass and chicory sward type. So the medium seeding rate that we used there was sufficient to establish chicory in that sward.
So they just got a better chance of establishing with that slightly higher seeding rate.
Yeah, so I suppose they were, I suppose it's something to do with it, taking advantage of that additional seeding rate in that mixture, yeah.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned the type of ryegrass putting in, whether it's diploid or tetraploid. Had that any impact?
Yeah, so we tried out seeding these mixtures with including either a tetraploid or a diploid perennial ryegrass in the mixture. I suppose where that had came from, or what the background to the thought behind that trial was, that the tetraploid perennial ryegrasses, they're a more erect plant, and there's more I suppose they're less dense at the base, and as a result, there's more soil. If you were to look into a tetraploid sward, you would see more soil in that mixture, in that sward, than if it was a diploid, which is a more dense type of sward. So the thought was that if you used a tetraploid perennial ryegrass, would that allow that bit more soil availability, or I suppose space at the base of the sward, to allow the clovers and herbs to establish. I suppose one thing that has been interesting, going back to the point that you raised about the density of sheep swards, is that even with using a tetraploid perennial ryegrass in a sheep sward, it's still very dense in comparison perhaps to cattle swards in that. I suppose the results that we saw from that, we did see a little bit of benefit in terms of white clover content and plantain content when you use the tetraploid. There was a little bit more white clover establishment and plantain establishment when you use a tetraploid, but we saw that it didn't really make much difference when you were talking about red clover or chicory. So again, I suppose as across all the plot studies that we have carried out here, we see that each of the sward types do behave slightly differently to one another. So I suppose it comes into question then, what should you do? What's the optimum across the board to use if you were using a multi-species sward where all those elements were together?
Okay, so look, the important thing to state there, I suppose, too, is whatever variety we pick, it has to be a good variety, because if we aren't trying to get any of these back in again, that's what you're going to be left with after a couple of years.
Yeah, so variety selection is crucial when you're looking at a multi-species mixture, the same as if you were putting in a ryegrass only sward. It's very important to choose an appropriate variety for I suppose for your system, for your soil type, and also, so it's very important. So for example, if you are using a multi-species sward mixture and you accept that some elements of that sward will not persist and won't survive long term, it's important that you choose appropriate varieties and good varieties from the recommended lists in terms of particularly your perennial ryegrass in that mixture and your white clovers in that mixture, so that if the other elements do not persist over time, that you're left with a good grass clover sward in the long run.
So we can get the established methods correct, we get a good sward established. Our grazing management afterwards can have a big impact on how well a reseed performs. You've looked at a lot of different aspects of this, different pre-grazing and post-grazing sward heights. I suppose in terms of the companion forages, it was perceived that it might be slightly different in terms of our post-grazing management. What have you looked at and what have you seen?
Yeah, so that has been a particularly interesting trial. So the trial that we carried out, a plot trial under the same sward mixtures, we varied the post-grazing sward height. So we had 3 different post-grazing sward heights. They were set to 4 centimeters, 4.75 centimeters, and 5.5 centimeters. And we followed that over a 3-year period. And I suppose that's a more longer term trend. So I suppose the results really come at the end of that study. So in the 3rd year, so those swards were sown in, I think, July 2019. And then we measured them for 3 full production years after that. So 2020, 21 and 22. And if we look at the forage contents, the content of clovers and herbs left in those swards by the 3rd year, so in 2022, we saw that there was similar levels of white clover left in those swards across the board. So post-grazing sward height wasn't having a significant impact on white clover content in the swards. It was very different, however, then when you went to look at the likes of red clover. So for example, the red clover, there was very little red clover remaining in those swards in year 3 when it was grazed to 4 centimeters. So it really didn't suit the severe or intensive grazing management. It persisted a lot better in the medium, 4.75 centimeters. There was significantly more red clover left in that sward in year 3 when it was grazed to that medium severity, and then there was slightly less then when it was grazed to the 5.5 centimeters. So it seemed that it was most suitable at the medium post-grazing sward height of 4.75 centimeters. I suppose what was the most interesting for me anyway was the inclusions of the clovers, the herbs, the plantain and the chicory. So there has been, I suppose, a thought process or a school of thought that the implementing a higher post-grazing height would, I suppose, help the persistency of the herbs and allow them to, persist a bit better. But that's not exactly what we saw in this study. So there was actually less plantain and chicory in those swards into year 3 under the 5.5 centimeters. So the lax grazing treatment relative to the 4 centimeters and the 4.75 centimeters. And I guess it comes into question as to why. So also it's important to notice that in these plot trials that we were carrying out here to vary the post-grazing sward height, they were in a very small area, and so the rotation, or I suppose the duration that they're in that sward grazing was very short in comparison to what it would be in a commercial, rotational grazing system. So I guess it comes into question whether the length of time that they're grazing was having an impact then, instead of the post-grazing sward height.
And even in your larger system study, a residency period in them paddocks relative to maybe what we see on commercial farms was short. So yeah, maybe potentially that could have an impact.
Yeah, so I guess it definitely does illustrate that post-grazing height does have an effect on the persistency of those sward types, those forages over time. But there's a lot more at play than just the post-grazing sward height.
So I suppose to take the key line of it, with the exception maybe the white clover, very tight grazing as post-grazing to our fortune, which what we see in the early part of the season is not maybe ideal for some of the other herbs or the red clover, but neither is lax grazing.
Yeah, so I suppose it was very evident that the severe grazing did not suit the red clover particularly. I suppose if you were to look across the board, the intermediate post-grazing height was probably the best across the board for the different forages. And then the lax one perhaps wasn't as suitable as might have been expected. So I suppose from carrying out that trial, what you would notice is that if you keep grazing to that lax post-grazing height of 5.5 centimeters, when it gets into the middle of the season, you do get a build-up of dead material in the sward, and perhaps that is having some effect, perhaps shading out the light available to those herbs, or I suppose I can't answer all the questions in one plot trial, but it definitely was very interesting, and hopefully more work will be carried out in that area in the future.
And again, you're going to compromise sward quality if you let go. Just look in terms of the pre-grazing height. I imagine you're not letting covers get too high, given it's a sheet sward. You might just give us a bit of an idea of what covers you're going in at.
Yeah, so for this trial, we just had a standard. We were going in at about 12 to 1,500 kilos of dry matter per hectare across the board. Yeah,
kept it consistent. So Lisa, just for anyone that's maybe considering putting this in, having infrastructure in place, having the ability to subdivide an area if you're going putting it in is important. And I suppose, secondly, for a performance point of view too, you'd ideally like to keep a finishing batch of lambs maybe on the sward in the first year.
Yeah, so it's obviously very important to have, your appropriate infrastructure around that reseed to get the most benefit that you can out of your investment. So, I suppose from the animal trials, we would have seen that, the most of the benefit in terms of animal performance that you could get from mixed swards is coming in the post-weaning period, where the lambs were performing significantly better in the post-weaning period compared to that when they were grazing a grass-only sward. So I suppose to get the most out of that, I suppose you can use that information to your benefit. So to prioritize perhaps an area that you would have in a mixed species for post-grazing or post-weaning lamb performance, and I suppose picking off perhaps a batch of lambs and putting them onto that. So using then having appropriate infrastructure then to use that to rotate around that area, to use that to the most benefit that you can.
Stock it accordingly. No, it would make sense. Lisa, look, it was great getting that update from you today. It's certainly something of interest. It's good having you on.
Thanks very much, Kieran.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. Lisa's covered a lot of different aspects that have an impact on the success of that sward when you're establishing it, and the importance of the management afterwards. I have included a link in the description to a presentation Lisa gave this year's National Sheep Conference, where she goes through some of the impact that has on performance and more detail about the productivity of those swards. It's well worth a watch back. That's it for me for this episode. Again, for updates on our sheep program, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more episodes.